Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you guys all for coming. We're going to start off with Bradley Kuhn. We're going to start off with Bradley Kuhn to give our keynotes and go on from there. So, Bradley?
Yeah. So if you guys can be quiet on that side.
What's that?
Quiet on that
Absolutely.
side? Yeah. So I appreciate you all coming out early on a Saturday morning to listen to me. I much appreciate it. So I'm going to start off by telling you, because I know not everybody might not be able to see, and the slides are online so you can follow along. That's ur1.ca 9xllk if you want to pull up a laptop and read the slides that way. And the sources are available, of course, so you can get those as well. I'll start out by explaining who I am and tell you what it is that I do. So currently my day job is I'm president and executive director of an organization called the Software Freedom Conservancy, which is a nonprofit organization. But it's not the first nonprofit that I've worked for. I also spent many years working for the Free Software Foundation. I'm currently on its board of directors. And this means I spent a lot of time working with Richard Stallman, and I still consider him a personal friend, and I'm on the board of directors of FSF in addition to my day job at the Software Freedom Conservancy. So I spent a lot of time studying what the FSF did. And a lot of people don't realize the FSF was the first nonprofit organization to think about all these issues of free software and software freedom and rights and things that users should have when they get software and the ability to modify and improve it. And I've actually spent a lot of time reading the first document that I encountered that introduced me to free software, which is the GNU Manifesto, which I discovered because if I mentioned the backspace versus delete arguments of Emacs, would folks in the room know what I'm talking about? Okay, so enough laughs. So I installed my first copy of Emacs in 1991. And there was this argument about whether Control-H should be backspace or the delete key should be backspace. And I was using a terminal where Control-H was backspace, and by default in Emacs, Control-H was help. Now, this was a huge, basically technical argument about how a keyboard should be laid out and all these other things. But I actually think RMS did this on purpose, because normally when you start pounding on the backspace key, you are about to type something else. So you hit the backspace a bunch of times, you type something else. Well, if you hit Control-H and then certain key sequences in Emacs, it gave you copies of things like the GPL or the GNU Manifesto. So I don't think it was planned that basically most people would end up reading the GNU Manifesto because their backspace key was actually help and it threw up a copy of the GNU Manifesto when you were trying to actually delete something in the buffer you were working in. So that's how I ended up reading the GNU Manifesto. Okay, they're giving me a mic. Apparently I'm not loud enough. So now I have to lower my voice because I have to be sure I'm not shouting at you across the microphone. This is how I first read the GNU Manifesto, and it basically, reading the GNU Manifesto changed my life. I'm a FSF type, hardcore software freedom person through and through. I always will be, and I don't make any apologies necessarily for that, but I do realize that's a very political thing. But there were a couple of things that really struck me in the GNU Manifesto that these days are not talked about as much in the free software world as they once were. And one of the things that RMS says in the GNU Manifesto is that, well, we don't have to worry about having for-profits to fund software development. We could just charge a software tax. And then people could apply to this tax pool and get funds to fund software. Now, I'm not advocating that we add a software tax. Every piece of hardware you buy, you pay the software tax, and then there's some sort of government agency that decides what software is funded. I'm not promoting that at all, but it's an interesting idea to think about, and think about what a society would be like that designed software basically through the government. And if you look at the government of Brazil, it's more or less what Brazil is doing right now, and there's a lot of interesting free software being developed in Brazil because of it. The other idea that I think is really interesting is this quote right here about just asking for donations, putting your software out there, sharing it with the world, and saying, hey, if you like this software, send me a donation. Send a donation to help support the continued development of this software. I actually believe that model can truly work. And in fact, most people don't realize that the FSF, which was founded basically within 6 months of when the GNU Manifesto was written, and received its charity status, I'm going to talk a little bit more about 501c3 status in a few minutes, in 1985, it spent the first 12 years of its existence purely funding developers to write free software. That's a plurality of its history. A large part of FSF history was just to do software development. And if you go back and read some of the old GNU's bulletins, which the FSF used to produce, it's all about how they were developing GNU, developing free software, paying people to write free software. In fact, I went through these old GNU's bulletins. I started looking at names of people that developed free software. They're names like Roland McGrath. Now, Roland McGrath is actually one of my heroes. He's an unsung hero of free software. He started writing glibc when he was 15 years old in the 80s, in the late 80s. And he worked for the FSF for many years on glibc. He wrote most of GNU Make. And these days he works for Google now, funded again to work on glibc. And he's back working on glibc these many years later. The project he started as a teenager. The guy's a prodigy, and people don't even realize this. But these are the types of people that were funded over the years, full-time staffers or sometimes part-time staffers of the FSF, to work on documentation, to work on implementations of free software, improvements to free software. One of the most interesting one that's lost in some ways to history is that the Debian project was, in its first year of life, funded by the FSF. Ian Murdoch was a staff person at the FSF, and I didn't even know this when I went to work for the FSF. In 1999, when I got my first job at the FSF, I was going through basically payroll record folders, and I see Ian Murdoch's name. I'm like, Ian Murdoch? Like the same Ian Murdoch who founded Debian? And sure enough, he had been an employee. I asked RMS, so we funded him to work on Debian when it got started. So this idea that a non-profit organization should pay people as a charity to write free software is part of our history. It's part of the culture. It doesn't happen as much as it used to. And if you would ask RMS this question, and he says it in his speeches about, well, now we have volunteers writing free software. And of course, volunteers are great. Every nonprofit, you go to any nonprofit here local in Philadelphia, you'll find that they need volunteers. They have lots of things they need volunteers to do. And it's certainly true that a free software project that's operating in a nonprofit way needs volunteers to contribute. But the default case of these volunteers is not actually that they're volunteering altruistically on their nights and weekends. In the old days, people used to write proprietary software during the day and then come home and work on GNU at night. I mean, this was very common in the late 80s and early 90s. These days, it's only from the point of view of the projects they're volunteers. These volunteers are actually being paid by companies who have an interest in the free software project to contribute. I mentioned Roland McGrath, used to be a staffer of the FSF years ago. These days, he's employed by Google to work on glibc. Why in the world would Google pay him to work on glibc? Well, that's an interesting question. They're paying him to write code that he gives away and shares. But before I get to explaining exactly what I think is going on there, I want to talk about the differences between for-profits and non-profit organizations. For-profits are what most people are familiar with. They are companies that act in the interest of their shareholders. For-profits basically have one thing in the world that they're trying to get done, and they're trying to generate revenue for their shareholders or their owners. Now, I'm not against profit. I'm not against the idea of making money. But I decided a long time ago, do I want on my tombstone, made a lot of money, died with millions of dollars? Well, I don't really care. I'm hoping to break even, right, of life. Like, I want to die with $0. That's like the optimal efficiency, right? And I don't need that much to live on. I mean, I have a relatively nice apartment, usual middle-class lifestyle. Well, what do I really need? I don't need Larry Ellison's boats or anything. So then you start to think about, well, if your main motive in life is not to make money, it's to do something you care about, do something good, and you just need enough money to live off of, then you don't necessarily need a for-profit, because for-profits are designed to make you money. This is why I got into working for charities. Charities are a neat aspect of our culture, our society, indeed our government regulations. Specifically, 501c3 charities. That's the IRS tax code designation for various types of charities, such as universities, churches, philanthropic organizations. There's lots of things that can be categorized as 501c3. They're very interesting organizations because they're legally required by the IRS in the United States to act in the public good. Everything I do as an employee of a charity has to be to promote a specific mission for the public good. In the case of Software Freedom Conservancy, I'm supposed to promote, defend, improve, and share software with the public so they can have better software. And I have to do everything I do in pursuit of that mission in my job. And so my view really is that software freedom, the right to copy, share, modify, redistribute software, everything you get with free software systems that you use, and I'm sure most of you are users of free software systems, that's a public good, that's a public benefit. And so the right fit for it, in my view, is a nonprofit organization. And it's not that we can't take money from people. If you heard me on the mic in the beginning, I was trying to find a way to get a donation from a company. We take donations from companies and nonprofits. But these IRS regulations create a nice firewall. In fact, I get in trouble with the IRS, and the Conservancy could lose its nonprofit status if I give any special benefit or inurement to a for-profit company or to any individual specifically. So while we have lots of for-profit donors to Conservancy, lots of individual donors, every nonprofit in the free software world takes those kinds of donations. They can't allow those donations to influence their behavior. So it creates this firewall of funding so that you're not being pushed in a direction that a company wants you to go in. And that brings me back to this idea of the for-profit volunteer. These people who are writing code all day for free software, and they're being paid by their employee to do it. In fact, most of the code we get, if you go look at a Git log of any free software project, almost any free software project, you're going to find most people are on their day jobs, whatever in their time zone is their day, work day, they're going into work, and they're contributing to that free software project on their employer's time. Sometimes their employer's paying them outright to do it. Sometimes they're getting this 20% time thing that I think Google invented, although maybe it was somebody else and Google just decided HP invented it. Oh, really? So I'm told HP invented the 20% time idea, which I should thank my HP colleagues for that, because it's been a real boon to free software. Because this idea that you can take one day a week of your time at work and contribute to some free software project that interests you to make it better, to improve it, that's gotten a lot of people contributing to free software. But the fact is that the more people being paid by their companies to write free software, they're going to be influenced by their job. Everybody is. You're going to have people around you that want features. Right now, a member project of Conservancy, in fact, Git, has a lot of people who contribute to Git working on Google. Well, I talk to them a lot, obviously, because they're part of the Conservancy. And obviously, they've got their colleagues all using Git inside Google, and they're all requesting features and so forth, and they're probably features that are going to benefit everybody, and they're putting them upstream into the project so that it's getting out there to the world. But the fact of the matter is, I have to admit, Google is making a lot of decisions about what direction Git goes in because they're employing the developers. They're not doing it purely as an altruistic motive. Google does a lot of things altruistically, but I don't think they're employing engineers with purely an altruistic motive. They're employing them because, well, we can do some good, and also we can get the features we need into the free software code bases. So I actually think we need a counterbalance to this. As much as I believe that developers will do the right thing most of the time, it's sometimes tough. So I think we need a counterbalance where people being funded by nonprofits, that are only acting in the public good, are being funded through those nonprofits to do free software development. Now, I put this quote from my colleague Jeremy, who is not only, he's sort of a great example because he's an employee of Google, he's one of the co-founders of the Samba project, and he's also on the board of directors of the organization that I work for. Now, he said this to me once, and I actually asked him, I said, do you really want me to put this quote on a slide? Because you say steal. And he said, no, make sure, I said, I can make it a little, you can say something else that's a little less strong. He said, no, say steal. The developers should be stealing the time from their employer. Give it to free software. That's the future of free software, steal time. And so I think that he has a certain ethic about free software that's really close to mine, that he basically believes free software is right, it's a moral imperative, we have to do it. And so he's worked very hard in his career to create positions for himself at various companies that he's worked for, Sun, Novell, now Google, that basically he tells his bosses to leave him alone. He's from a relatively rough neighborhood in the United Kingdom, and so he would say it, and I just tell my employers to something off, because that's the way he talks all the time. But that's the idea behind what he does. But I don't think everybody can get away with that. Jeremy's basically a celebrity of free software, so he has the ability to do that. But most people who work for a company can't just tell their employer to F off and do whatever they want and work on whatever free software they want to. They're going to have to answer to someone. So while I think this is a great idea and you should try a little bit of it, it's not an answer for everybody. It's only an answer sort of for the highest level free software celebrities. And the thing I regret most about my career is I didn't get in early in some key project like Linux or Samba, because I was around at the time, but frankly I wasn't a very good coder, so I didn't get into it as much as I would, because those people sort of have the ability to say this to their employers, but not everybody else will. And so the code bases are going to drift. Now I think it's great if you can get a job paying you to work on free software, and you should take one, but your employer's going to want something for that. They're going to want the code base to go in a direction they like. The neat thing about what nonprofits can do is they can go out into the world and collect donations that are tax-free in two different ways. One way is that as a 501c3 charity, the organization I work for doesn't pay any taxes in the United States, or in the state usually that you're registered in. We're in New York. Also, if you donate to Conservancy or FSF or Apache Software Foundation or any of these 501c3 nonprofits, you get to write it off if you itemize on Schedule A. So it's basically, whether you're an individual or a company, a tax write-off to give to these nonprofits. Now, I take that very seriously, because from my point of view, that's a government grant. Basically, the government of the United States has decided that what we're doing is good enough for the world that we shouldn't ever have to pay any taxes on what we're doing. And the people who give to us shouldn't pay taxes on the money they donate to us. And so I take that really seriously as basically the government's giving away something because it's deemed to be in the public good. So when a nonprofit spends its money, it's got to be doing it in a way that advances the general interest of the public and making the world a better place. And the neat thing that this does for free software projects is it makes sure that they aren't under undue influence from for-profit companies. In fact, the IRS won't let us. We'd lose our nonprofit status if we allowed our projects to be unduly influenced by companies. It's not that companies aren't out there, aren't contributing, aren't using it, but the nonprofit provides this neutral territory for the project where no one company has particular over-control or influence. And the leadership can be handled through the nonprofit. So the leadership decisions are always made in terms of what's best for the project, not necessarily what's best for an individual developer or best for a company that's sponsoring that developer. So now, if we went out there and said, okay, every free software project needs a nonprofit. Well, this started to happen in the early 2000s. And there was basically what was sometimes called an organizational proliferation. Every free software project, it would start up, it would get to a certain size, and it would go form a nonprofit. And of course, this splits the donor base, right? Because if you install a free software operating system like Debian or something like that, you're going to get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of free software projects installed just in the base install, let alone when you start the aptitude installing a bunch of stuff you're interested in. Well, in that scenario, if you want to go donate to a project, you're sort of like, well, I have to go donate to all the hundreds of projects? Like, I'm going to give each 20 cents and then be done with it, or what, right? So the other problem is, so there's this split, confusing donors, like where do I donate to help this free software stuff? The second problem is that every single project has a lot of paperwork to do. It is not a fun task, really, to run a nonprofit. There are meetings, and there are minutes you have to file with the state, and forms you have to file with the federal government, and all sorts of messy things you have to do as a nonprofit. And as nonprofit organizations started to come into existence for free software, developers who would rather be out writing code, making their projects better, ended up doing this kind of boring work. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not as good of a coder as I'd like to be, but I'm a really good masochist. So I don't mind doing work that sucks. And so I spend my time doing this work in the idea that let the guys who are better at coding than I am be writing the software, and I'll go and I'll make sure all this paperwork is filed. So the idea is to aggregate a lot of these projects into one or a couple of different nonprofits. And Conservancy, the organization that I work for, is one of these. There's a number of them. I mentioned a few. There's Software in the Public Interest, SPI, which is the home of Debian. There's Apache Software Foundation. There's Eclipse Foundation. There's Outer Curve, which is Microsoft's attempt to enter the space, creating a nonprofit. And so there's a few choices, but each one has a lot of different projects in it. So Conservancy is actually the aggregate of all the projects that are our member projects. We have about 38, and we're growing all the time. We have applications in the queue at all times, the people that want to join. And one of the things we do is we make sure each project has its own funds. So when you donate to Conservancy, you can donate to the general fund, which is just a general donation, which does things like support my salary. Or if you're particularly interested in one of our projects, you can say, I'm interested in that project. I want to donate earmarked for that project. So you can pick one of our projects off of our list and say, that's the one I want to donate to. That's who I want to give money to. The nice thing is that there's only one set of all that paperwork, all that infrastructure, all the meetings and all that. There's one board of directors. There's one Form 990, which is the annual filing you have to make with the IRS if you're a nonprofit. One of everything. So each individual project gets the benefit of the aggregate of that work being done for all of them at once. Now, there are a lot of things you can fund through nonprofits. There are a lot of things you can't, which it's funny because the most common conversation that becomes an issue with one of our projects is the things we can't fund. But there are a lot of things we can fund. And in fact, the thing we fund the most in Conservancy, most of our projects, they have somewhere between $1,000 and $3,000 a year in donations they're getting. Usually that money is used to send a developer to go speak at a conference. And so we're able to get developers to conferences so they can work on code and Hackfest, or so they can speak about the work that they're doing. The largest philanthropic program right now in free software is the Google Summer of Code. It's a multi-million-dollar program that funds students for the summer to work on free software and then funds the organization that sponsored them to mentor those students throughout the summer. And they send everybody to an annual conference as well. We handle basically huge amounts of Google Summer of Code issues for all of our projects. About 10 of our projects are in this year. We've had as many as 20 in past years. So being able to aggregate that, have one communication path to get that huge donation from Google, distributed among all the projects that were in the Summer of Code, that's a big thing that Conservancy does as part of our work. Then we also actually run some conferences. A number of our projects, the Selenium project, the Evergreen project, have their own conferences, so we handle all that stuff. I don't want hackers to have to go in and be negotiating with venues for contracts. Jonathan can tell you how hard it is to pull off an event. I want to thank him for putting this event together. It's hard to do that. And developers who are working on code shouldn't have to worry about getting to a meeting to go meet with a venue to get the air conditioning sorted out or whatever needs to happen. Right? That's not what hackers should have to do. That's the kind of thing Conservancy does for them. Probably the biggest thing, I'm going to spend the rest of my talk talking about this one aspect, is actually paying developers. I actually have on contract now at Conservancy 7 different developers who are being funded full-time to work on their projects. That, I think, is a really central aspect of what these nonprofits can do. Most of our projects, as I mentioned, have $2,000 or $3,000 a year. Some of them have hundreds of thousands a year that they're able to raise in donations because they're hot, exciting projects. And we're able to fund the developers to actually write code for the projects. And instead of having to go get a job and then convince their employer, oh, I want to keep contributing to my free software project, what they're doing is saying, well, I actually am a contractor to a nonprofit. All I have to do is make sure my code makes the world a better place. I want developers out there to have that impetus, that my job is to make the world a better place with code. And that's what Conservancy does. All the while, it's our job to make sure that we're not building people's pools. I talked about things we can't pay for. So if some developer says, I want to build a pool in my backyard, let's spend some of our project's money on that. That's when I say no. No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to build a pool for you. Nobody's ever actually asked me to build a pool. It's just the example I've always used. But that's the kind of thing we prevent. We make sure the money, if you're a donor to one of these projects, we make sure your money's getting spent in a way that's good for the project. I want to talk about a couple of the successes we've had doing funding of developers. one of the most interesting things that happens in a project that's more of an infrastructure or library type project, like the Twisted framework is for Python, it's a network framework, a network programming framework and library, is that people don't take care of the core. Once the core gets good enough, everybody starts using it to build applications. And the core sort of has this slowdown in commits and improvements because the folks who wrote it then all get contracting jobs writing applications using it. So they don't have as much time as they used to contribute to the core of the project. So what we did is, for Twisted, is we went around getting donors of companies that cared about Twisted. They had applications built on it. They used it every day. And we got enough funds to fund for 2 years, part-time, Jean-Paul Caldron, who was one of the founders of Twisted, to just work on maintenance of the project, to not focus on any applications, anything like that, just maintenance of the main core library, improving features in the core library. And we're actually going through another cycle of fundraising now. He went off and did some consulting for a while after that ended, but now he's looking to do it again. So we're looking to raise money again and to again fund him, this time full-time. We're hoping to fund him for a year just to work on the core of Twisted. Another interesting case is Mercurial, which is one of our earliest member projects. And it was a small member project, usual a couple $1,000s a year. And at Linux Collaboration Summit in 2010, Matt McCall was standing there with me at breakfast and was, actually I think he came to Linux Collaboration Summit just to ask me this question, as I found out later. And he says, you know, I'm finding myself doing Linux, but I have to do this entire context switch when I go back to work on Mercurial, and it takes me a week to do the context switch. He says, I want to just work on Mercurial full time. I said, well, let's figure out a way to do it. So we wrote up a proposal and we sent it around to a bunch of companies that depended on Mercurial. And by the end of it, and by ongoing fundraising, we funded him from April 2010 all the way through to June 2012. The money just ran out for his funding. So I hope you'll donate because we've just run out of money from Matt and we want to keep him going. So if you like Mercurial, you should donate go to the Mercurial website and donate to support Matt's work on Mercurial. And we're going to do a whole round of fundraising, hopefully get him funded for another year. But we've been funding him for years now just to maintain Mercurial. That's his full-time job, is to get on IRC every day, to go through the bug queue, to add features, to handle patch review and merge requests. And projects need that. They need the person who sits there and maintains the project, does patch review, and all that sort of thing. And it's very hard to get a company to fund just that, somebody to do that work full-time. But it's exactly in our mission. Our mission is to make the world a better place. Mercurial makes the world a better place. And Git's a member project of us, too. So it's not like I have a bias. Actually, we have Darks, Git, and Mercurial all members of Conservancy. So I have to have no biases among the DVCS systems. But anyway. So another project that joined recently is the PyPy project, which is a new, it's not actually that new, it's 10 years old now, but it's a different approach to the Python language implementation than the traditional C Python that Guido originally wrote. And it's actually written in Python, it has a just-in-time compiler, it has all sorts of great features. And they've amazed me because they keep saying, our community is so big, we can just keep launching big fundraising campaigns for different aspects of PyPy and get funding. And so they launched the Py3K project, which is to get Python 3 support into PyPy. They raised about $40,000 on that. And after they did that, they're like, well, we're going to do another one. We want to do numerical Python and get better support for NumPy into Py3K, or into PyPy rather. And I said, well, okay, but you just did a big fundraising campaign, so it's really hard to raise money again, like when you just asked everybody for money. Like, oh, no, there's different people that'll give. Sure enough, they raised another 42, it ended up being 42,000 both in the end. They raised for both those projects. Then 3 months later, they're like, oh, Armine Rigo, this one developer, he has this great idea for doing transactional memory and software, and he's got this proposal written up. I'm like, there's no way you're going to raise any money for that, because you just raised a total of $80,000 in a matter of 4 months to support a bunch of software development, and you're going to go ask the community again? They're like, oh, no, it's different donors. I'm like, yeah, right. Okay. I said, we'll put it up there. I figure we'll get a couple $100. So we launch it at PyCon. I get back from PyCon, and there's already $5,000 earmarked for that project. And right as of this morning, there's $21,000, $21,500. Actually, it was $21,498, I think, this morning when I checked. And that's funding another developer right now to work on that. And so we're funding 4 developers just in the PyPy project. Now, this is an anomaly because PyPy is a really exciting project in the Python community at this particular moment. But the general idea holds, which is when a project is exciting and hot, there are people that want it to get better, and there are people with money that want it to get better, and they want to donate to it. And they want to fund the development of it. And a nonprofit organization can provide the platform and venue to channel that funding without having it be like, oh, now we have to be profitable. My job's break even, right? Nonprofits just break even. Sometimes we're a little worse than break even. Our budget was a $30K deficit this year. We had some money in the bank, so we're okay. But the point is I don't have to make a profit. I just have to make the public good better. And it's a much easier motive to meet and much easier to fund software development when you don't have to figure out how you're going to make a whole lot of money because your VCs want it. It's weird to say this in a space like this, but which is designed for those types of organizations. But I think nonprofits actually have this special aspect to them that I think is, I mean, I'm doing it, obviously, so I see it every day, but I think on the whole it's underutilized in the free software space as a method for funding and improving free software. Most free software developers I meet, they have an idea, they've built an application or a library, they're using a lot of free software, but their idea is to go move into one of these places and do a startup. But from my point of view, I think doing it through a nonprofit might be the right way to get the project moving forward and give it a longevity where it's not just like a boom and bust kind of thing that happens with VC-funded startups. Instead, you have something that's there, it's taken care of. It's a long-term thing that's taking care of the project. So that's pretty much all I have. We have some time for questions. I hope you'll donate. I always have to, because the one thing if you're a nonprofit, you're always asking people to, we're a charity, right? So it's truly charity in that way, like please give money. So there's the link. I hope you'll donate to the Conservancy or any of the nonprofits I mentioned. They're all good organizations and need help. Apache Software Foundation, FSF, those sorts of organizations. And there's just URLs and stuff, social media you can find me on. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, I'll start in the front here.
Yeah, so I have a two-part question. So, do you think for-profit endeavors is acting in the public good? And if they can they deserve attention from open source software developers? I was thinking, growing the economy, regardless of something positive, so writing investment algorithms, or say you think Disney movies make the world a better place, if you were to write something like a blender that pays attention to Disney-specific resources or whatever. And the follow-up to that would be if they are worthy of open source software development, does that kind of blur the line of where, that was the intended end user. Obviously, they'd be expected to shape expectations for development. How do you...
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a little bit disingenuous when I go through that slide about for-profits, admittedly. So his question is, I'm going to summarize for you. I just shout if I'm saying it wrong. The question was basically, don't for-profits have a certain amount of good that they're doing in the world? They're creating jobs, and don't they have a place in free software as doing that?
My specific question, I guess, is I think that's not really debated. But my question is, if they do, and so if open source software people want to create software that is each and only used by big investment banks or something like that, because they think that's valuable, wouldn't those entities, those for-profit entities, as the end user, wouldn't they have some say in how it's been developed?
Yeah, and actually, so he's saying, wouldn't they have a say particularly if it's a niche project that's only of interest to a group of for-profit companies? Wouldn't they have a say? And in fact, I would say, shouldn't they have a say in how it goes? And I actually agree with that. So let me explain a little bit what I'm getting at. So I think there are various different types of free software. The ones I'm most interested in are these sort of larger, broader projects that are of interest to everybody, individuals, companies, so forth. And that's sort of more of what's inside Conservancy as far as projects go. And I think that even in those cases, for-profit companies should and do have a say in how it goes. I just think that they shouldn't be in complete control. And one of the important things that I try to make the distinction about, which I was saying I am a little bit disingenuous about, is I trust a lot of the individuals I know. So I know individuals that work for Google, that work for HP, that work for IBM, all sorts of places. I even know individuals who work for Microsoft and Apple and other companies that I don't trust at all. But those individuals care about the free software projects they're contributing to or are doing the right thing. So I think that the problem comes in is when the corporate machine is there, because the corporate machine is designed to produce shareholder value. And in fact, it's legally required that you produce shareholder value. Every decision on the for-profit side you have to make as a manager is, does this increase shareholder value, particularly if it's a for-profit, public, traded company. And so I think that motive is dangerous. And I want free software to have a lot of motive of public good in it, which is why I think we need the nonprofit counterbalance. I don't want for-profit contribution to go away. I think it's important, and we need it to continue, and we need the input because they're a part of our community. But I see companies as just one part of our community that we should be listening to, but not letting drive. That's sort of what I'm saying. And the other part you asked, which is sort of this thing of, well, what if there's a project that's only of interest to a bunch of investment banks? In fact, there's a type of nonprofit that's perfect for that, which is not the kind I'm talking about, the C3s, but there's something called a 501c6, which is a trade association. Like the classic 501c6 is a Chamber of Commerce of Philadelphia would be a 501c6. All the businesses join it because it helps all businesses if more people come to Philadelphia. Me coming here is good for them because I'm going to buy lunch here, and then suddenly it's good, so they, so forth. So you can form those types of organizations when you have just a group of companies. In fact, Outer Curve, which is the Microsoft nonprofit, is a 501c6. Eclipse Foundation is a 501c6, originally formed by IBM. Linux Foundation is a 501c6. So I think there's a room for that type of nonprofit too, which is more of a corporate, shared common business interest type of nonprofit as well. So yeah, I think there's actually a lot of options in the space that we could expand. I just think we haven't explored enough the nonprofit space of how to promote free software. Yeah, you had a question too.
Yeah, I'm actually involved with the Free Software Foundation, and one of the things we struggle with is we have a fair bit of money, so we can actually do some good, but some of the things we struggle with is how do you sort of preserve that community atmosphere, in an environment where, one developer gets to be the lucky guy who gets paid, or fund a conference. Well, do you want to fund the one in Europe, or do you want to fund the one in California, or do you want to fund this one right here?
Yeah.
And where you have the money, you can potentially do some damage, but if you're not careful, you can do damage to yourself.
Right. So actually, I think the question I'm gonna rephrase the question in my own terms. So just shout if I did it wrong. But it's a question. It's really comes down to the question of does spending by a nonprofit eviscerate the volunteer core? Because this happens a lot, right? When you start funding people to write free software, there have actually been studies that show if people are being funded to write the free software, fewer people volunteer to do it. And so you got to be careful. And I could tell you in almost all these examples, there have been fights in the communities about this, and it's changed things, and it changes the project forever. You bring money into the picture, and it changes things. Nevertheless, I still think it's valuable because I've seen things get done that wouldn't have gotten done otherwise. And there are projects like Postgres project's a great example. Postgres will not fund a developer to work on Postgres because they tried it once and it was a disaster and it caused all these fights, and so they're like, oh, no one can ever be paid to do software development. Because that's a rule of their community they felt they had to create. And I get why they have that rule, and I understand that it caused trouble, and it can cause trouble. And if you go read, some of the PyPy mailing lists are public. You can go read some of the arguments that were had as developers are getting funded. But I still think it's valuable because there's people who are focusing on work that they didn't have time to focus on because they were busy doing consulting contracts. Now they can turn and do a consulting contract for the public good. So I think it's a careful balance, and you've got to be careful and prioritize volunteer contribution, and prioritize encouraging volunteers to contribute to the community. But I think if it's really publicly disclosed, which is another thing nonprofits have to do, and you're clear with the community about who's getting paid, who's not, why you picked who you're paying, and so forth, and do a really public process, I think you can mitigate a lot of the problems. But I don't deny problems are seriously there, and you have to be really careful when you start funding into the nonprofit world.
Something like bug bounties would be a better idea for...
But what was you saying?
Bug bounties, so small price to fix a bug.
Yeah, people have tried bug bounties a lot over the years, and they've had mixed success. I don't dislike the idea. I think the problem has been the venue. The problem is always the person evaluating whether the bug was actually closed. And you sort of need this neutral party that can make that decision. Because I've seen a lot over bug bounty stuff. I've seen there have been fights over, well, you didn't actually close the bug that I was trying to express. And then there's a fight, well, but no, I think I did. And then you need somebody to sort of triage that situation, a trusted party. So if you have that trusted party, somebody in the community that can do that, I think it can work. But without that, I've seen it go very, very wrong sometimes as well. There was a bunch of hands up. I'm going to get to you in a second. He was hands down before.
So I work for a medium-sized software company that uses a lot of free software in our production environment. Mm-hmm. I feel like they don't contribute back. Mm-hmm. What practical steps can I take to convince them that contribute back either financially or with time for developers to work on code is the right thing to do?
It's a good question. So the question he's asking is if you work for a company that makes a lot of use of open source and free software but doesn't really give back, neither in code nor cash, how do you convince them? I think it's a multi-pronged approach. I would start with engineering, right? Because if you're one engineer saying we should give back, and your colleagues aren't saying it to the managers as well, you're just going to be a crank. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. Whereas if all the engineers are saying, we really use these projects, so get a groundswell of support from engineering to really talk to the managers about it. And you can often pitch, for the cash side, you can pitch it to the managers as benefit for recruiting and benefit for the product placement in some sense. Most of our free software projects, and this is permitted if you're in a nonprofit, have a sponsors page that lists a bunch of logos. I call it the NASCAR page that has all the logos of all the people who've given money and say, look, we want to be on that page. We're using this stuff. We want people to know we're using it because A, we're going to need to recruit people that know it. And if people in the community know that we use it, they're going to be more likely to apply. And two, we want people to know about whatever widget we make. We want people to know about it in that community because the first customers might be the people who know the underlying stuff we use. So that's one way to do the cache thing. For the code thing, it's the usual arguments you have to make of we don't want to maintain a fork. We need to give this patch back. It's really going to help us in the long term if we get a patch back. One of the that used to be the old answer I would give 10 years ago. That answer is harder to give now because a lot of the free software projects out there work so well that you don't actually need to change it to make really good use of it. In the old days, you had to fix things because everything was broken. Less and less, fewer and fewer things are broken, particularly like in Linux. Like I remember when I first used Linux, like I had to patch like X to get it to work, right? So you don't have to do that anymore. So it's much easier to use. So that's a tougher argument to make. But I think another argument you can make is career development for people who work there, and say we need the opportunity to be collaborating with our colleagues in these projects because that's part of our career development. We're just going to go work somewhere else. Your best people are going to leave if they don't feel like they're fulfilled by being in these communities. And if they're relying on the software, people are going to get familiar with it. And the smartest and best people go to the places that will let them participate in the community. So that's another argument you make. I think it's an ongoing thing. It's just you have to really be raising it all the time. And persistence is important. I'll get to you in a second. I'm going to get to him first. Yeah, stand up for a while. Let's be fair. We'll go back to it. I'm going to get you first.
Do you have some fiscal guidelines you use to how much you pay, let's say, administrator or 501c for government, how much you pay a developer? I mean, is there like a limit you'll pay a developer?
So he's asking, are there guidelines or limits of how much nonprofits can pay? So this is actually a big argument in the nonprofit space. If you follow the Susan G. Gorman Foundation stuff, and when people started to get upset at them, they started looking at the salary, which I always encourage people to go download the 990, which is the annual form nonprofits file of any nonprofit you give to, and go right to the salary page. Because in the United States, every salary over $100,000 has to be disclosed. And also, any salary under $100,000 that's for a major executive has to be disclosed in any event. And so you should go and look at that. And that's sort of what the IRS has decided to do, is basically disclosure, and encourages the public to, hey, look at how much people are being paid before you do it. There's also the issue of private inurement and private benefit, which are rules the IRS has. So you can't pay someone so much that it's basically considered to be above market rate and private benefit. In reality, what happens is most nonprofits charge substantially less, or pay substantially less than what the private sector pays. And it's a big fight in the nonprofit community because nonprofits that pay high are saying, no, we have to get the talent, we have to pay a lot. I know for myself that I'm in the nonprofit sector because I believe in it, and I don't mind that I get paid a lot less than I would in the private sector, so I've sort of been against that. I believe we should pay less, and in fact, Conservancy somewhat has that policy. We try to keep development contracts, and we have a lot of fights sometimes with our projects saying, I know you can go get a contract for $400 an hour, but you're not going to get that kind of contract from Conservancy because it's just not a nonprofit rate that we can pay. Go take that consulting work if you can get it. If you're working in the public good, it has to be in the public good. We do have rules like that. Basically, our rule is at $75 an hour, we require the board of directors to review the rate before we'll pay it. So that's sort of the rule that we've set. The fellow had a comment back here. Go ahead. I want to get your comment. It was back on this other point. What did you want to say?
It was back to the...
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
It was tied back to both your comments.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Companies who did before, they've had companies... If there's an open source company, like you were talking about before, usually you can pay for a feature enhancement or something like that, because they actually have the direct developer. So I think that's actually where having corporations around software projects actually helps the people on staff to pay for it.
Oh yeah, I agree. I agree with you. A lot of our free software is getting written by people on staff of a for-profit company, but it's a complicated dance because if it's a for-profit company that just uses the code, they're just going to want the code to go in a certain direction for them. Consulting companies I found do better at this than basically like product companies, because consulting companies have a better ethos of sort of like we need this infrastructure to be there and we have to improve it because the way we deliver quickly for our clients is that. But when a company is more trying to just produce some sort of widget, whatever that widget might be, or some sort of site, it's tougher to get them to sort of see the value in contributing to core. At least that's what I've seen.
No, but this was a company that actually, when they hired the developers of the open source project, they were a consulting company, but they would have all the core developers.
Yeah, I mean, I like to see more balance than that. I'd rather them be distributed among various different companies, mainly because then one company doesn't have sort of the entire sailboat of the project and can go off in their own direction. But generally, I think the idea is good. I mean, we need that. We need both, is really what I'm saying. There's lots of for-profit companies paying free software developers. Wow. I turned the mic off and it went away. So, so now I'm not mic'd anymore. But more questions. We're almost out of time, so I can probably take one more question if folks have it. I'll let you go again since nobody else is asking, so you go for it.
So I have a friend who recently got a job offer as a developer, and I've often heard of non-moving clauses, but this guy in his contract was told that any software he writes while employed, regardless of the industry in which it applies, regardless of whether the employer is, he signs over ownership of all code written, and I guess that's very interesting to you. My question is if that's a common practice or is that ever...
It is actually. So the question was, companies ask people to sign over not just what they do on the job, but anything they think of or do on their off hours as well while they're employed. This is incredibly common and incredibly disturbing. It's also very easy to negotiate away. A lot of folks, when they show up on their first day and they're handed that contract, because a lot of times they don't even have you sign it during the interview process. They hire you and then make you sign the first day. You're actually in the catbird seat with regard to signing it. You can say, I don't agree with this term. I'm going to mark it up. One of the best things to do is say, even if you don't have a lawyer bluff it, just say, well, I really don't want to sign anything without my lawyer looking it over. And they're probably going to immediately say, oh, no, wait, what's wrong with it? What's the problem? You say, well, I'm going to cut that section, cut that part. And you should actually have a lawyer look it over. As some additional information on this, I do an podcast with my colleague Karen Sandler, who is also a lawyer, and the address is faif.us. It was on the last slide. She did a talk about this specific issue of employment contracts on a show way back. We played the talk and talked about it. She did. So faif.us. I forget what episode it was. It's probably like 15 back, maybe 20 back. So that might be of interest, because she actually had slides and talked about that issue of negotiating away those kinds of agreements. But yeah, you should tell people when you go to work for them, say, well, what I do in my own time is mine, and a lot of times tell them I'm already contributing to these free software projects. I want them accepting any patches or contributions given them. Those are mine, not yours, no matter when I do them. And a lot of companies will be okay with that, particularly if they're hiring you because they knew you were a developer in that project. Because you say, well, that's part of being a developer in this project. And there's another note on that. The Samba project, for many years, although they've now retired this, they had a requirement that all copyright has to be the individual's copyright, which sort of forced everybody who worked on Samba to have that conversation with their employers. And that worked really well for many years. So that's another feature of a project that they made it so that wouldn't happen to people who contribute to that project. All right, I think we're out of time, so I'll be around for a few hours. So if folks have personal questions they want to ask, it's fine with me.